Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The weight of what waits below. From Marcus, the old Peterbilt's diesel engine rumbled beneath me like a sleeping giant as I guided her down the winding mountain highway, my cargo of industrial machinery shifting slightly with each curve. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a pale green 2:47 a.m., and the rain had been falling steadily for the past hour, creating a hypnotic rhythm against the windshield that threatened to lull me into dangerous drowsiness. I'd been driving for 11 straight hours, pushing the limits of my logbook, but I was determined to make the delivery depot by morning. That's when I saw the exit sign emerging from the darkness ahead, its reflective surface catching my headlights like a beacon. Rest area 1 mile, it read, with an additional placard beneath that made me slow down to read it properly. Beneath Mountain View Bridge. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the past 5 years, but I couldn't recall ever seeing this particular rest stop before. The mountain roads all looked the same in the darkness, though, and fatigue had a way of playing tricks with memory. The off-ramp curved sharply to the right, descending at a steep angle that made my trailer brakes hiss as I downshifted. My headlights swept across towering concrete pillars that rose from the earth like ancient monoliths, supporting the massive highway bridge that stretched overhead. The rest area was tucked directly underneath this concrete canopy, creating a cave-like atmosphere that felt both sheltered and somehow oppressive. A few dim sodium lights cast sickly yellow pools across the cracked asphalt, illuminating a handful of weathered picnic tables and a standalone restroom facility that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. I parked my rig alongside the only other vehicle in the area, a newer Freightliner with Illinois plates and a refrigerated trailer that hummed quietly in the darkness. The driver was nowhere to be seen, probably catching some sleep in his sleeper berth. I understood the feeling completely. My own eyelids felt heavy as lead weights, and every muscle in my body ached from the long haul. The sound of rain pattering against the concrete bridge overhead created an oddly muffled acoustic environment, as if the entire rest stop existed in its own pocket of reality, separate from the world above. After setting my air brakes and shutting down the engine, I climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in shallow puddles that reflected the amber glow of the security lights. The air beneath the bridge felt different somehow, thicker and more humid than it should have been for this elevation and season. There was an underlying smell too, something earthy and damp that reminded me of old basements or caves that hadn't been disturbed in years. I attributed it to the perpetual moisture that probably collected under the bridge, creating its own microclimate. The restroom facility stood about 50 yards away, its concrete block construction stained dark with water and age. A single fluorescent light flickered sporadically above the entrance, casting erratic shadows that danced across the wet pavement. As I approached, I noticed that the building seemed older than the bridge itself, as if it had been there long before the highway was constructed and the engineers had simply built around it rather than demolishing it. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with an electrical hum that seemed louder than it should have been, and the fixtures themselves looked like they belonged in a facility from the 1960s. The mirror above the sink was spotted with age and moisture damage, creating a distorted reflection that made my tired features look even more haggard than usual. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to shock myself into alertness, but the water had an odd metallic taste when a few drops reached my lips. When I emerged from the restroom, I noticed something that made me pause. The Freightliner that had been parked next to my truck was still there, but now I could see that its trailer doors were standing wide open, revealing an empty cargo space. More unsettling was the fact that I could see into the cab through the passenger window, and it was clearly unoccupied. No sleeping driver, no personal belongings visible on the dashboard or seats. The truck looked abandoned, as if whoever had been driving it had simply vanished. I approached the other vehicle slowly, my footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space beneath the bridge. The engine was still running, just idling quietly, and when I peered through the driver's side window, I could see the keys dangling from the ignition. The logbook lay open on the passenger seat, and I could make out recent entries in neat handwriting, the last one dated just 2 days ago. Everything about the scene suggested that the driver had intended to return shortly, yet there was no sign of where he might have gone. A movement in my peripheral vision made me turn toward the darkness beyond the reach of the rest area's lights. The concrete pillars supporting the bridge created deep shadows between them, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing motionless in that darkness, watching. When I looked directly at the spot, however, there was nothing there but the geometric patterns of shadow and reflected light playing across the wet concrete surfaces. The sound that reached my ears then was subtle at first, almost lost beneath the ambient noise of rain and the distant hum of traffic passing high overhead on the bridge. It was a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against concrete, coming from somewhere deeper beneath the bridge structure. I found myself walking toward the sound almost without conscious decision, drawn by a curiosity that overrode my growing unease. The rest area extended further back into the shadows than I had initially realized, with the concrete pillars creating a forest of support columns that disappeared into darkness. The tapping sound grew more distinct as I moved deeper into this concrete wilderness, and I began to distinguish multiple rhythms, as if several sources were creating the sound simultaneously. My footsteps seemed to echo strangely in this space, bouncing off the concrete surfaces and creating confusing acoustic reflections that made it difficult to determine exactly where sounds were originating. Between two of the massive pillars, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the concrete surface were dozens of names, dates, and brief messages, scratched deep into the material with what must have been tremendous effort. The dates went back decades, some so weathered they were barely legible, others that looked disturbingly recent. "Stopped here 3 days, can't leave, something wrong with the road," read one message, dated just last month. Another simply said, "The bridge doesn't want to let go." The tapping sound had stopped, but in its place came something far worse, the sound of footsteps approaching from multiple directions, slow and deliberate, splashing softly through the puddles that dotted the concrete floor. I turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source of the sounds, but the acoustic properties of the space beneath the bridge made it impossible to pinpoint their origin. The footsteps seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the concrete surfaces until they became a confused murmur of movement in the darkness. That's when I saw them, figures standing motionless beside various concrete pillars, barely visible in the dim spillover from the rest area's lights. They appeared to be people, but there was something wrong with their posture, their complete stillness, the way they seemed to blend with the shadows, as if they had been standing there for a very long time. I counted at least 6 of them, all facing toward the center of the rest area where my truck waited. I began backing toward my vehicle, moving as quietly as possible, but the figures tracked my movement without appearing to turn their heads. As I drew closer to the lighted area, I could see them more clearly, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. They were wearing the clothes of truck drivers from different eras, some in modern high-visibility safety vests, others in flannel shirts and baseball caps that looked decades out of date, and one figure that appeared to be wearing the type of work clothes that hadn't been common since the 1950s. The sound of my truck's engine turning over had never been more beautiful to my ears. I climbed into the cab with shaking hands, immediately engaging the air brake's release and throwing the transmission into gear. As I pulled away from the rest area, I glanced in my side mirrors and saw that the figures had moved, no longer standing by the concrete pillars, but now arranged in a line along the edge of the lighted area, watching my departure with that same unnatural stillness. The on-ramp back to the highway seemed longer than I remembered, winding upward through the darkness with a grade that made my engine work harder than it should have. When I finally merged back onto the main highway, I was shaking so badly I had to pull over at the next legitimate rest stop just 20 miles down the road. This one was brightly lit, modern, with multiple other vehicles and the comforting signs of normal human activity. I tried calling the highway department the next morning to report the abandoned truck, but when I described the location, the dispatcher insisted there was no rest area beneath the Mountain View Bridge. The Synchronous Mile, from Jake Morrison. The CB crackled to life at exactly 2:17 in the morning, cutting through the steady drone of my Peterbilt's engine as I rolled through the Nevada desert. I'd been running solo for the past 6 hours, nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional ghost town flickering past my windshield, when that familiar static filled my cab. "Eastbound driver in the red Pete, you copy?" I glanced in my mirrors and spotted the headlights maybe a quarter mile back, steady and bright against the star-drunk sky. Another trucker looking for conversation to push back the loneliness of the long haul. God knows I could use the company. "Yeah, I copy. This is Jake in the 379 Peterbilt. What's your 20? "Right behind you, driver. Name's Marcus. Mind if I pace you for a while? These desert stretches get mighty quiet." I keyed the mic. "No problem at all, Marcus. Always good to have company on the midnight run." That's how it started. Just two drivers sharing the empty highway like we'd done 1,000 times before. Marcus matched my speed perfectly, staying a respectful distance back, his headlights a comforting presence in my mirrors. We talked about the usual things: dispatch troubles, truck stop coffee, the weather rolling in from the west. His voice was steady and warm, with just a hint of a southern drawl that reminded me of drivers I'd known for years. About an hour later, another set of headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger until a blue Kenworth pulled alongside us in the passing lane. The CB squawked again. "Looks like we got ourselves a little convoy going here. This is Tommy in the KW. Y'all mind if I join this parade?" "More the merrier," I replied, settling back in my seat. "Jake in the Pete, and that's Marcus behind me." Tommy fell into formation ahead of me, his running lights cutting a path through the darkness. The three of us stretched out along the highway like beads on a string, our engines humming in a rhythm that felt almost musical. The miles rolled by easier now, punctuated by easy conversation about routes and rest stops, about families waiting at home and cargo bound for distant cities. But it was when the fourth truck joined us that I first noticed something odd. The Freightliner appeared without warning, materializing from an on-ramp I hadn't seen coming. The driver keyed his mic and introduced himself as Carl, his voice carrying the same measured cadence as the others. He slotted into position behind Marcus, and suddenly we were 4 trucks moving through the desert night in perfect synchronization. "Nice night for a run," Carl said over the radio, and Tommy agreed, and Marcus chimed in with something about clear skies and good visibility. But as I listened to their voices crackling through the static, something nagged at me. There was a sameness to their words, a rhythm that felt rehearsed somehow. When one of them spoke, the others would respond in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. I shook off the feeling and adjusted my mirrors. The desert was playing tricks on my mind, that's all. Too many hours of straight driving, too much caffeine and not enough sleep. When you spent enough time on the road, your brain started finding patterns in things that were just random coincidence. The convoy grew as we pushed deeper into Nevada. A white Volvo joined us near Carson City, then a forest green Mack outside of Fernley. Each new driver introduced himself with the same easy familiarity, each one falling into formation like they'd been planning this meeting for miles. Their names were different, Steve, Robert, Daniel, but their voices carried that same unhurried quality, like they had all the time in the world to reach wherever they were going. By 3:30 in the morning, we were 8 trucks strong, our headlights stretching across the desert floor like a river of light. The CB chatter had settled into a comfortable rhythm, drivers sharing stories and observations about the road ahead. But the more I listened, the more that nagging feeling in my chest grew stronger. No overlap, no hesitation, just perfectly timed responses, as if they were all listening to the same conductor. Then I noticed how they all seemed to know details about the route ahead that shouldn't have been common knowledge. Which rest stops would be closed, where construction might slow us down, which way stations were running late-night inspection. "There's a good truck stop about 40 miles ahead," said the driver in the Volvo. His name was Steve. I think, though, their voices were starting to blur together in my mind. Clean showers, decent food, might be worth a stop. "You Brid," came Marcus's voice from behind me. "Could use a break to stretch the legs." One by one, the others chimed in with their agreement, each response coming at precisely measured intervals. I found myself counting the seconds between transmissions, and sure enough, each driver waited exactly 3 seconds before keying his mic. 3 seconds. Every time, like clockwork. I keyed my own mic, my thumb hesitating over the button. "Sounds good to me. What's the name of the place?" In my mirrors I could see the headlights of the trucks behind me, steady and unwavering. Ahead, Tommy's Kenworth maintained its position with mechanical precision. When the response finally came, it was Marcus who spoke, but his words sent a chill through my chest. "The synchronized mile, driver. You'll know it when you see it." I'd been driving long haul for 12 years, and I'd never heard of any truck stop called the synchronized mile. More troubling was the way he'd said it, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. I reached for my atlas, flipping through pages with one hand while keeping my eyes on the road. Nothing. No truck stops, no rest areas, not even a wide spot in the road for the next 60 miles. Another pause, longer this time. When the response came, it wasn't Marcus who answered. It was all of them, speaking in perfect unison, their voices blending together until they became one voice echoing from the CB speaker. "Trust the road, Jake. The road knows where you need to go." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The desert outside my windows seemed to press closer now. the darkness beyond my headlights deeper and more absolute than it had been minutes before. In my mirrors, the convoy stretched out behind me, 7 sets of headlights following my every move with unswerving precision. When I changed lanes to test them, they all changed lanes. When I adjusted my speed by just 2 miles per hour, they matched it exactly. I tried raising other drivers on the CB, scanning channels for any voice that didn't belong to the convoy. Nothing but static and the occasional burst of Spanish from some distant trucker probably hundreds of miles away. Every time I returned to Channel 19, I found them waiting, their collective presence filling the airwaves like a barely audible hum. "Jake," came the unified voice again, and I couldn't tell anymore which truck it was coming from. "You're thinking too hard, driver. Just follow the lights ahead. Follow the road." The highway began to change around me, subtle at first but becoming more pronounced with each passing mile. The guardrails looked older, rustier, like they hadn't been maintained in years. The road surface shifted from smooth asphalt to something rougher, more weathered. Even the mile markers seemed off, displaying numbers that didn't match my odometer readings. The entire convoy decelerated in perfect synchronization, 8 trucks moving as one organism through the desert night. That's when I saw the lights up ahead, a cluster of neon signs glowing against the darkness like a mirage made real. The truck stop materialized out of nowhere, a sprawling complex of fuel pumps and parking spaces that definitely hadn't been on any of my maps. The main building was a low, rambling structure with windows that glowed yellow in the night, and above it all, a massive neon sign flickered the words "Synchronized Mile" in letters that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Tommy pulled into the lot, and one by one, the other trucks followed. I watched them file past my windshield, each driver visible now in the glow of the truck stoplights. But what I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Not similar, identical. The same weathered face, the same graying beard, the same tired eyes staring straight ahead as they maneuvered their trucks into parking spots with mechanical precision. They moved like puppets controlled by the same string, their actions perfectly coordinated down to the smallest gesture. The double transit from Marcus Holloway to Cal. The CB radio crackled with static as I adjusted my rear-view mirror for what felt like the 100th time that night, watching the empty highway stretch behind my 16-wheeler like a ribbon of darkness, punctuated by the occasional streetlight. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across the Midwest, and I'd never seen anything quite like what started happening 3 weeks ago on Route 287. Somewhere between the Nebraska cornfields and the Colorado foothills, where the land begins to remember it, wants to be mountains. It began innocently enough, the way most unsettling things do. I was pulling a load of agricultural equipment toward Denver, the kind of run I'd done dozens of times before, when I noticed something peculiar in my side mirror. Not the big convex one mounted on the door frame, but the smaller rectangular mirror positioned just inside the cab, the one truckers use to keep an eye on their blind spots, and the space directly beside the trailer. This particular mirror had been acting strange lately, showing reflections that seemed just slightly off, as if the glass was warped or the mounting was loose, though every inspection revealed it to be perfectly secure and undamaged. The first time I really paid attention to the anomaly, I was stopped at a truck stop outside of Grand Island, waiting for my mandatory rest period to end. The sodium vapor lights cast everything in that sickly orange glow that makes even the most mundane truck stop feel like a scene from some dystopian movie, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee while watching other drivers move about their pre-trip inspections in the mirror's reflection. That's when I noticed him. Another driver standing beside his own rig, a man roughly my age with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of highway sun beating through windshields. What struck me as odd wasn't his appearance, but rather the fact that when I glanced directly out my window to nod a greeting, there was no one there. The space beside the other truck was empty, illuminated but vacant, yet when I looked back at the mirror, there he was again, clear as day, going through what appeared to be his own inspection routine. I rubbed my eyes, chalked it up to fatigue, and tried to dismiss the incident. But the image of that phantom driver lingered in my mind, like smoke from a distant fire. The mirror would show me scenes that weren't quite matching reality, subtle differences that would have been easy to miss if I hadn't spent so many years relying on these reflective surfaces to keep me safe on the road. Sometimes it was other vehicles that appeared in the mirror but weren't actually there when I checked directly. Other times it was the same stretch of highway, but with different weather conditions, as if the mirror was showing me the road during different seasons or times of day. The most unnerving incidents happened during the long stretches of night driving, when the world outside the cab became a cocoon of darkness, broken only by the sweep of my headlights and the occasional oncoming traffic. I'd catch glimpses in the mirror of my own truck, but wrong somehow, as if I was seeing myself from the outside, watching another driver who looked exactly like me, navigating the same route, but in a slightly different reality. This other version of myself would make the same turns, stop at the same rest areas, even seem to drink coffee at the same moments I did, but there were small differences that made my skin crawl with unease. One particularly foggy night, as I was climbing through the mountain passes west of Denver, the mirror began showing me something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. In the reflection I could see my own cab interior, but sitting in the passenger seat was a figure I couldn't quite make out clearly. Someone who shouldn't have been there because I always traveled alone. The figure was perfectly still, facing forward, and appeared to be wearing clothes similar to mine, but every time I tried to focus on the details, they seemed to shift and blur like smoke. The part that had kept me safe through millions of miles and countless weather conditions insisted that this was nothing more than fatigue-induced hallucinations, perhaps combined with some optical effect created by the fog and my headlights reflecting off the moisture in the air. Truckers are prone to seeing things during long hauls, especially on familiar routes where the mind can drift and fill in details that aren't actually there. But this felt different, more substantial and consistent than the fleeting shadows and phantom movements that sometimes plague long-distance drivers. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a wind-swept plaza perched on a mountain shelf, with a view of the valley lights twinkling far below like fallen stars. The parking area was nearly empty except for two other trucks, whose drivers were presumably catching their required rest in their sleepers. I climbed down from my cab and walked around to examine the troublesome mirror from the outside, running my fingers along its edges and checking for any looseness or damage that might explain the strange reflection. The mirror appeared completely normal, properly adjusted and securely mounted, its surface clean and free of the road grime that usually accumulates during long hauls. But when I positioned myself to look into it from outside the truck, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat and sent a chill racing down my spine despite the mild mountain air. Instead of reflecting the truck stop parking lot behind me, the mirror showed a completely different scene, as if it were a window into another version of reality. In this other reflection, I could see what appeared to be the same truck stop, but older somehow, shabbier, with different buildings and an atmosphere that felt heavy with age and neglect. There were more trucks in this version, older models from decades past, and the drivers moving around them wore clothing that seemed to belong to an earlier era. Most disturbing of all, I could see myself in this reflection, but not as I currently was. This other version of me looked older, more weathered, and moved with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. As I watched, transfixed and unable to look away, this other version of myself climbed into what appeared to be the same truck I was currently driving, but somehow different, as if it were the ghost of my vehicle, or perhaps a shadow cast across time. The other me started the engine, and I could swear I felt the vibration through the ground beneath my feet, even though my own truck was silent and still. The other me pulled out of the parking lot and onto what looked like the same highway, but heading in the opposite direction, as if he were traveling backward through the route I had just completed. The spell was broken when another truck pulled into the lot, its air brakes hissing and diesel engine rumbling, the sound and movement snapping me back to the present moment and the normal world around me. When I looked back at the mirror, it showed only the expected reflection of the truck stop, the mountains, and my own concerned face peering back at myself. But the memory of what I had seen lingered like a bad taste, and I found myself questioning not just what I had witnessed, but the very nature of the reality I thought I understood. I climbed back into my cab and tried to settle down for some rest, but sleep proved elusive as questions churned through my mind like tumbleweeds in a desert wind. Was I somehow seeing into parallel versions of my own life, roads not taken, or perhaps roads that existed simultaneously alongside the one I was currently traveling? The mirror seemed to be showing me reflections of reflections, layers of reality folded back on themselves like an infinite regression of possibility. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp mountain air that usually helps restore perspective and common sense. But the mirror's strange behavior continued. As I navigated the winding descent toward the plains, I caught glimpses of that other driver again, the one who looked like me but wasn't quite me, following the same route, but in a world that seemed just slightly shifted from my own. Sometimes our actions would sync perfectly, both versions reaching for coffee at the same moment, or adjusting mirrors simultaneously. Other times the other me would do things I hadn't done, take exits I had passed by, or stop at locations I had never visited. The most unsettling moment came as I was approaching a way station, a routine stop that I'd navigated hundreds of times before. In the mirror, I watched the other version of myself pull onto the scales, but instead of the familiar uniformed officers I expected to see, there were figures in clothing that seemed strange and outdated, and the building itself looked different, more weathered and somehow more ominous. The other me seemed to be having some kind of difficulty or argument with these officials, gesturing and pointing in ways that suggested frustration or fear. When I actually reached the way station myself, it was closed for maintenance, orange cones blocking the entrance, and a simple electronic sign directing trucks to proceed. But I could swear I heard voices carried on the wind, the sound of an argument or confrontation that seemed to echo from that other reality I'd glimpsed in the mirror. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly eager to put distance between myself and whatever parallel drama was playing out in that reflected world. The Whaling Intersection. For Marcus Cole, the thing about driving freight through Nebraska at 3 in the morning is that you start to believe you're the only person left in the world. My Peterbilt's headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional reflective mile marker. The CB radio had been silent for the past hour, not even static to keep me company, just the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the whisper of tires on worn pavement. I'd been hauling electronics from Denver to Chicago for the better part of 15 years, and this stretch of Highway 30 had become as familiar as my own backyard. Every curve, every rise and dip in the road, every lonely intersection marked by weather-beaten stop signs that most folks ignored anyway. Out here, you could see headlights coming from 5 miles away, so rolling through a deserted crossroads at 2 miles per hour instead of a complete stop never seemed like much of a sin. It was a nothing crossroads, just 2 strips of cracked asphalt meeting in the middle of corn country, marked by a single stop sign that had been leaning at a tired angle for as long as I could remember. But something made me ease off the accelerator that night. Maybe the way my headlights seemed to catch something unusual about that familiar red octagon. It stood perfectly straight, and even in the pre-dawn gloom, it seemed somehow more vivid than it should have been, like someone had repainted it with that reflective paint that highway crews use. The white letters seemed to glow against the red background, crisp and new. My air brakes hissed as I brought the rig to a complete stop, and that's when I heard it for the first time. At first I thought it might be my brakes cooling down, that metallic settling sound that big rigs make when you've been working them hard. But this was different, higher pitched, almost like a whistle but not quite. I rolled down my window and killed the engine, letting the cab settle into silence. The sound continued, and I realized with a strange chill that it was coming from the direction of the stop sign. It wasn't mechanical at all, but organic somehow, like the sound a person might make when trying to whistle through clenched teeth. As I sat there in the darkness, listening to this bizarre noise, I noticed that the stop sign seemed to be vibrating slightly, just enough to catch the light from my headlights in an odd way. I should have put the truck in gear and driven away right then. Every instinct I'd developed over years of long-haul driving was telling me to get moving, to put this weird intersection behind me, and chalk it up to fatigue and too much coffee. But curiosity got the better of me, the way it always does when you encounter something that doesn't fit into the orderly world you've constructed for yourself. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The night air was thick with the smell of growing corn and an odd metallic scent that reminded me of old pennies. As I walked toward the stop sign, that whistling sound grew more distinct, and I realized with growing unease that it wasn't just one note, but a melody of sorts, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost musical. The metal was pristine, without a single scratch or rust spot, and when I reached out to touch it, the surface was warm despite the cool night air. The whistling sound was definitely coming from the sign itself, though I couldn't figure out how. There were no holes in the metal, no loose brackets that might vibrate in the wind, and anyway, the night was perfectly still. I played my flashlight beam over the sign's surface and noticed something that made my skin crawl. The white letters that spelled out "stop" seemed to be moving slightly, shifting and flowing like they were painted with something liquid. As I watched in fascination and growing horror, the letters began to blur and reform, rearranging themselves into different words that I couldn't quite make out in the dancing beam of my flashlight. The whistling sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't whistling at all. It was screaming, a human voice raised in agony or terror, but filtered somehow, distorted until it sounded like wind through metal. The scream rose in pitch and volume, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering across the sign's face, as the letters continued their impossible dance. That's when I saw what the letters had spelled out, just for a moment before they shifted again. "Help me." The words were there for perhaps 2 seconds before dissolving back into "stop." But I knew what I'd seen, and the voice trapped in the metal was no longer screaming but sobbing. Great wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. I ran back to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs, and fumbled with the door handle with hands that had suddenly gone clumsy with fear. The engine turned over on the second try, and I had the transmission in gear before I'd even fully closed the door. But as I began to pull away from the intersection, something made me look in my side mirror, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. The stop sign was bending toward my truck, actually bending like it was made of rubber instead of steel, leaning so far that it should have snapped at its base. The red surface was pulsing now like a heartbeat, and the screaming had become a wail that I could hear even over the roar of my diesel engine. But worse than that, worse than anything I'd ever seen in 15 years of night driving, was the shape that seemed to be pressing out from inside the sign, like someone trapped beneath ice, pushing against the metal surface with hands and face, and desperate, reaching fingers. I floored the accelerator, and my heavily loaded truck responded with a surge of power that pressed me back into my seat. In the mirror I watched the stop sign snap back to its upright position, but the screaming followed me for nearly a mile down the highway before it finally faded into the distance. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to pull over at the next rest stop and sit in the cab for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive again. I called my dispatcher that morning and asked him about County Road 47, whether there had been any accidents there recently, anything that might explain what I'd experienced. He was quiet for a long moment before telling me that intersection had been the site of a fatal crash about 6 months ago. A young woman named Sarah Chen had missed the stop sign in heavy fog and been struck by a grain truck. She'd died instantly, he said, but her car had been wrapped around that stop sign post, and it had taken the rescue crew 3 hours to cut her free. I've been driving a different route to Chicago ever since, adding an extra 100 miles to my trip to avoid County Road 4. But sometimes, late at night when I'm fighting sleep on some other lonely stretch of highway, I hear that sound again, faint but unmistakable. It's not just one voice anymore, but many voices, all of them screaming, all of them trapped in metal and paint and the endless repetition of a single urgent word. Because I've learned that stop signs aren't just traffic control devices, they're memorials, and sometimes the people they commemorate aren't quite ready to let go of the world of the living. Sometimes they have something to say, and the only voice they have left is the wind through matte vibration of steel, the awful endless scream of someone who knows they should have stopped, should have seen the danger coming, should have had just one more second to hit the brakes and change everything. I haven't driven past County Road 47 since that night, but I know the sign is still there waiting for the next driver who's curious enough to stop and listen. And I know that Sarah Chen is still trapped inside that red metal octagon, trying to warn someone, anyone, about the intersection where she learned too late that some stops are permanent. It just travels from sign to sign, carried on the wind that moves between the metal, spreading like a contagion of regret and unfinished business. And every night driver who's been on the road long enough has heard it at least once, that high, keening wail that sounds almost like wind but isn't, almost like brakes but couldn't. The singing load. From Marcus Wheeler, the thing about hauling freight cross-country is that you get to know the sounds. Every trailer has its own voice, its own way of talking to you through the miles. Empty containers ring hollow over potholes, livestock trailers shuffle and stamp, and refrigerated units hum their electric lullabies through the night. But in 23 years of long-haul trucking, I'd never heard cargo that sang back to the road itself. It started on a Tuesday evening in late October when I picked up the load from a warehouse outside Bakersfield. The dispatcher, a thin man with nervous eyes, handed me the manifest without much explanation, just gave me an address in Portland, and told me the cargo was delicate, temperature controlled, and absolutely could not be late. The trailer looked standard enough from the outside, white refrigerated unit, with the usual warnings about maintaining the cold chain. But when I did my pre-trip inspection, I noticed the refrigeration system was running quieter than most, almost silent, actually just a whisper of machinery working somewhere deep in the trailer's belly. I'd hauled everything from lab rats to rare orchids, and the scientific community always had their particular requirements about temperature and handling. What struck me as odd was the routing they'd specified. Instead of taking I-5 straight up through the Central Valley like any sensible driver would, they wanted me on the mountain route through the Sierra Nevada, then across to Highway 97, more curves than a snake's backbone, and slower going, but they were paying hazmat rates plus a substantial bonus for following their exact path. The sun was setting behind the coastal mountains as I pulled out of the warehouse lot, and the first few hours passed uneventful. The trailer rode smooth and quiet, the refrigeration unit maintaining its whispered operation, and my old Peterbilt hummed along the empty highway with the reliable consistency that had made her my partner for the past 8 years. The radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, talk of way stations and weather, and I settled into the familiar rhythm of night driving. Just past Tehachapi, where Highway 58 begins its serious ascent, I was downshifting for a long sweeping curve when something changed in the trailer behind me. The refrigeration unit's whisper became something else, something that might have been mistaken for mechanical stress or air moving through the cooling system, but carried an oddly musical quality. As I leaned into the curve, the sound grew clearer, almost like a sustained note from some enormous wind instrument. I pulled over at the next truck stop and did a walk-around inspection, checking the trailer's exterior and listening at the refrigeration unit's housing. Everything appeared normal. The temperature gauge showed a steady 38 degrees. The unit was cycling properly, and there were no obvious mechanical issues. But when I pressed my ear to the trailer's side, I could hear something that definitely wasn't the usual cargo settling or equipment operation. It was a low, harmonious tone, almost like singing, but muffled and distant. Back on the road, I tried to convince myself it was just an acoustic quirk of the trailer's construction, maybe air moving through the cargo in an unusual way. But as the highway curved through the mountain passes, the sound became more pronounced and unmistakably musical. Long, sustained notes that seemed to respond to the motion of the truck, growing stronger and clearer as I navigated each turn. By the time I reached the steepest part of the grade, where the highway switchbacks through granite walls, the trailer was producing what could only be described as a chorus of voices, harmonies that rose and fell with each curve, like the trailer's contents were responding to the G-forces, the shift of weight and momentum, creating some kind of resonance that turned the cargo into a massive instrument. I tried the radio to mask the sound, but even with the volume up, I could feel the singing as much as hear it, a vibration that seemed to come through the truck's frame and settle in my chest. Somewhere past midnight, climbing through a particularly twisting section of mountain highway, the singing began to change. What had been merely eerie became something that raised every hair on my neck and arm. The harmonies were still there, but underneath them, I could swear I heard individual voices, not words exactly, but the kind of vocal sounds that suggest intelligence, communication, maybe even emotion. Long, mournful calls that reminded me of whale songs. If whales could carry a tune and harmonize with mathematical precision. I sat in the cab for a long moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the pines, before climbing down to inspect the trailer again. The temperature was still steady, the unit still running normally, but when I put my hand on the trailer's side, I could feel vibrations that had nothing to do with machinery. Maybe the cargo was some kind of experimental resonance equipment, or musical instruments, being transported in a climate-controlled environment. Maybe the curves were causing some kind of harmonic feedback in whatever was back there. But as I stood in the mountain darkness, feeling those vibrations through the aluminum walls, logic seemed like a flimsy thing compared to the growing certainty that whatever I was hauling was aware of its surroundings and responding to them. I climbed back into the cab and continued up the mountain. But the singing had evolved again. The individual voices were becoming more distinct, more purposeful, and as I navigated each switchback, they seemed to anticipate the curves before I reached them. The harmonies would shift and build just before I started into a turn, as if the cargo could sense the changing direction and was preparing for it. maybe even enjoying it. The highway descended the eastern slope of the mountains in a series of dramatic curves that offered stunning views of the valley below during daylight hours. At night, it was just a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into darkness, marked by reflective barriers and the occasional glow of a distant town. The trailer's chorus had become a symphony by then, complex arrangements of voices that seemed to celebrate each sweeping turn with renewed enthusiasm. That's when I realized they were learning. The voices were becoming more coordinated, more intentional, building to crescendos that perfectly matched the apex of each curve. Whatever was in that trailer wasn't just responding to the motion anymore. It was participating in it, turning the act of hauling freight through mountain curves into some kind of collaborative performance between driver and cargo. The thought should have been disturbing, but as the hours passed and the highway wound through the wilderness, I found myself looking forward to the next curve, listening for how the voices would interpret it. Some curves brought gentle, flowing melody. Sharp switchbacks produced dramatic, almost operatic arrangements. Long, sweeping turns generated building crescendos that made the hair on my arms stand up with something that wasn't quite fear anymore. I was navigating a particularly beautiful section of highway that curved along the edge of a deep canyon when the singing suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not trailing off, but cutting out all at once like someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the whole world was holding its breath. I corrected automatically, professional instincts taking over, but the shift came again on the next turn. Stronger this time. Whatever was in that trailer was moving, and it was moving with purpose. What came from the trailer now was urgent, almost frantic, individual voices calling out in what sounded like warning or distress. The weight shifts became more pronounced with each curve, each one trying to pull the truck toward the drop-off side of the highway. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter, fighting to keep the truck in its lane, as something in the trailer actively worked against me. The voices behind me weren't singing anymore. They were screaming, high-pitched wails that seemed to be trying to tell me something important, something I was missing or ignoring. It wasn't until I crested a hill and saw the roadblock ahead that I understood. Construction signs, orange cones, and flaggers directing traffic into a single lane that would take vehicles away from the canyon edge. The cargo had somehow sensed what I couldn't see, had been trying to warn me or protect itself the only way it could, by shifting weight away from what it perceived as danger. I pulled through the construction zone and into a truck stop on the other side, my hands shaking as I backed into a parking space. The trailer had gone completely quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Peaceful, maybe even grateful. The gray between, from market. The fog rolled in like a living thing that November night, thick and deliberate, swallowing the truck stop parking lot one rig at a time. I'd been driving for 18 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen foods across the interstate highways that connect this country like arteries, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather Mother Nature could throw at a trucker. But this fog was different somehow, heavier than it should have been, clinging to my windshield in patterns that almost looked intentional. I'd pulled into the Flying J, just outside of Cedar Rapids around 11:30, my electronic log showing I had maybe 20 minutes left on my drive time before the Department of Transportation would consider me a hazard to public safety. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched the fog creep between the parked semis like fingers exploring a keyboard. My Kenworth diesel engine settled into that familiar rumble of idle, and I could feel the slight vibration through the driver's seat that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over the years. The truck stop had been busy when I'd first spotted it from the highway, its neon signs cutting through the darkness like a beacon for tired drivers. But now, wrapped in this unnatural fog, the place felt hollow somehow, as if the mist had drained away not just the light, but something more essential. The fluorescent glow from the fuel islands barely penetrated 3 feet into the gray wall that surrounded us, creating small islands of sickly yellow illumination that only made the darkness beyond seem more complete. I should have gone inside for coffee and a hot meal, maybe struck up a conversation with another driver about road conditions or freight rates. The kind of mundane shop talk that helps pass the time and reminds you that you're not alone out here on the endless asphalt. But something about that fog kept me in my cab, doors locked, engine running. Through my side window I could barely make out the outline of the big rig parked next to me, a Peterbilt with chrome stacks that had been gleaming under the parking lot lights when I'd pulled in. Now it was just a vague shadow, like looking at the world through frosted glass, but instead of the usual banter, I heard only static punctuated by what sounded like whispered conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. I adjusted the squelch and tried channel 17, then 21, but found the same ghostly murmur on every frequency, as if the fog was somehow interfering with the radio waves, bending them into shapes that carried meanings I couldn't quite grasp. My digital clock showed 11:58 when I first noticed the movement in the fog. At first I thought it was just the natural swirl of moisture in the air, the way mist moves when disturbed by wind or temperature changes. But as I watched through my windshield, wiping away the condensation with the back of my hand, the patterns seemed too regular, too purposeful. Shapes moved from truck to truck, tall and indistinct, like people walking through the parking lot, but their movements were wrong somehow, too smooth, too fluid, as if they were gliding rather than walking. I turned off my cab lights and let my eyes adjust to the darkness, thinking maybe the glare had been interfering with my vision. The fog seemed to pulse with its own dim luminescence, a gray glow that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shapes were clearer now, definitely humanoid, but stretched and distorted, moving between the parked trucks with what looked like deliberate intent. One passed close enough to my cab that I could almost make out details, a tall figure in what might have been a coat or uniform, but when I blinked and looked again, it was gone, lost in the swirling gray. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed the engine was running warm, which was strange because the night air had been cool when I'd parked, cold enough that I'd needed my jacket when I'd done my pre-trip inspection. But now the cab felt stuffy, oppressive, as if the fog was somehow trapping heat along with light and sound. I cracked the window an inch, hoping for fresh air, but what came in was thick and humid, carrying with it a smell like old rain, and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. Through the narrow gap in my window, I could hear sounds that the fog seemed to amplify and distort. The usual truck stop noises were there, the distant hum of refrigeration units, the occasional hiss of air brakes, the low rumble of idling diesels, but mixed in with them were other sounds. Footsteps on wet pavement that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, and voices speaking in conversational tones that never quite resolved into actual words. It was like listening to a radio station from very far away, the signal fading in and out of clarity, but never quite reaching the point where you could understand what was being said. My logbook lay open on the passenger seat next to a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and I found myself staring at the entries I'd made throughout the day, trying to anchor myself in the familiar routine of miles driven and fuel consumed. But even those simple numbers seemed somehow unreal now, as if the fog had created a space outside of normal time and geography, where the rules of interstate commerce and federal regulations no longer apply. I'd logged 347 miles from my pickup in Kansas City to this truck stop, but now I couldn't quite remember the details of the drive, the exits and landmarks that should have been burned into my memory after so many similar. At 12:15, my CB crackled again, and this time I could make out actual words, though they came through layers of static, like voices calling from the bottom of a well. A driver was asking about road conditions ahead, mentioning thick fog and reduced visibility, but when another voice responded, it sounded strange, the words slightly off rhythm, as if someone was repeating phrases they'd heard but didn't fully understand. I keyed my microphone to respond, to add my own voice to the conversation, but when I pressed the button, no sound came out, just more of that whispering static. The fog pressed closer against my windshield, and I started my wipers, hoping to clear away the moisture that had accumulated on the glass. But instead of sweeping away condensation, the blades seemed to smear something thicker across my field of view, leaving streaks that looked almost intentional, like someone drawing symbols in the mist. Through the distorted glass, the shapes moving through the parking lot were clearer now, and I could see that they were gathering around the other trucks, clustered near the cabs in groups of 2 or 3, their attention focused on the vehicles in a way that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I reached for my cell phone, thinking I should call dispatch or maybe the state police to report the unusual weather conditions, but the screen showed no signal, no bars at all, which was impossible this close to a major city. The phone's clock displayed the time as 12:23, then 12:23 again, the numbers frozen as if time itself had become trapped in the fog along with everything else. I shook the device and tried to power it off and on again, but the display remained unchanged, stuck in that single moment, like a photograph of minutes that would never pass. And I could see that what I'd taken for coats or uniforms were actually something else entirely, shapes that seemed to shift and flow like the mist itself, solid enough to cast shadows but transparent enough that I could sometimes see through them to the parking lot beyond. They moved with purpose, examining each truck as if looking for something specific, and I had the horrible realization that they were checking the cabs, looking inside at the drivers who were trying to wait out the storm. My engine coughed once, a sound it had never made before, and the steady rumble of the diesel began to develop an irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat under stress. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, and all my other systems were reading normal, but something was wrong with the motor, as if the fog was somehow interfering with the combustion process itself. I pressed the accelerator gently, trying to smooth out the idle, but the engine responded sluggishly, reluctantly, as if it was fighting against some invisible resistance. Through my side mirror I watched one of the figures approach the Peterbilt parked next to me, moving up to the driver's side door with that same fluid glide. It paused there for a long moment, seeming to examine the cab, and then I saw the truck's interior lights flicker on and off in a pattern that looked almost like Morse code. The figure moved away, dissolving back into the fog, and the Peterbilt's lights went dark again. The rubber trail. From Marcus A. I've been hauling freight across the southwestern desert for nearly 20 years, and in that time I've seen plenty of strange things on the lonesome highways that cut through Arizona and New Mexico. Mirages that dance in the heat, dust devils that spiral up from nowhere, and those peculiar lights that hover just above the horizon on moonless nights. But nothing prepared me for what started happening 3 weeks ago, when I began noticing the tires. It began on a Tuesday evening, as I was rolling eastbound on Interstate 40, my 18-wheeler loaded with electronics bound for Albuquerque. The sun had just dipped below the mesa line, painting the desert sky in deep purples and oranges, and the first stars were beginning to pierce through the twilight. My Kenworth diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm, a mechanical lullaby that had become as natural as breathing during my years on the road. The air conditioning whispered softly, keeping the desert heat at bay, while classic country music played low on the radio. That's when I first spotted them in my side mirror. 4 tires rolling along the shoulder of the highway, about a quarter-mile behind me. At first I assumed they'd fallen off some poorly secured load, which happens more often than you'd think out here. Truckers sometimes get careless with their tie-downs, especially when they're running behind schedule. But these tires weren't bouncing or wobbling the way loose cargo usually does. They were rolling in perfect formation, maintaining a steady pace and staying precisely in line with each other. I watched them for several miles, occasionally glancing in my mirrors as they maintained their exact distance behind me. They never gained ground, never fell back, just kept that same measured pace. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe they were caught in my slipstream, riding the air currents created by my trailer, or perhaps the slight downgrade of the highway was providing just enough momentum to keep them moving. But as the miles passed, and the tires continued their relentless pursuit, maintaining perfect spacing and direction, a cold unease began to settle in my chest. When I pulled into a truck stop outside of Gallup for fuel and a mandatory rest break, I expected the tires to roll past or veer off into the desert. Instead, they seemed to slow as I decelerated, coming to a stop somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of the station's harsh fluorescent lights. I could make out their dark silhouettes lined up on the shoulder, waiting with an almost predatory patience. The truck stop bustled with the usual late-night activity. Other drivers moved between the pumps and the convenience store, their voices carrying across the asphalt as they discussed routes and delivery schedule. The familiar sounds of air brakes hissing and diesel engines turning over provided a comforting backdrop of normalcy. I mentioned the tires to Pete, a veteran driver I'd known for years, describing how they'd been following me for the past 50 months. Pete just chuckled and shook his head, assuming I was pulling his leg or maybe suffering from road fatigue. He suggested I get some coffee and a good night's sleep, advice that seemed perfectly reasonable under the bright lights of the truck stop. But when I walked to the edge of the lot and peered into the darkness, I could still see them there, 4 dark shapes arranged in formation on the shoulder, as motionless as sentinels. Beckoned. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Tires don't follow trucks. It was impossible, irrational, the kind of thinking that comes from too many hours behind the wheel and too much caffeine. But when I pulled back onto the interstate, an hour later, well-rested and alert, the tires resumed their pursuit within minutes. They appeared in my mirrors as if summoned by the sound of my engine, rolling out of the darkness to take their position behind me. Over the next several days, The pattern continued with disturbing consistency. No matter what route I took or what time of day I drove, the tires would eventually appear. Sometimes they materialized from side roads, rolling out of nowhere to join my convoy. Other times they seemed to emerge from beneath overpasses or from behind roadside structures. They showed no preference for terrain, maintaining their formation, whether I was climbing mountain passes or cruising through flat farmland. The tires themselves appeared to be standard commercial truck tires, deep-treaded and substantial, though I could never get close enough to examine them properly. They rolled with an eerily silent motion, leaving no visible marks on the asphalt, despite their obvious weight. During daylight hours, I sometimes caught glimpses of them in rest areas or truck stops, always positioned just beyond the normal flow of traffic, watching and waiting with their hollow centers, like empty eyes. I began documenting their behavior, keeping a logbook of when and where they appeared. The notes revealed an unsettling intelligence to their movements. They seemed to know my schedule, anticipating my routes and positioning themselves accordingly. When I tried taking unexpected detours or making unscheduled stops, they adapted quickly, appearing on parallel roads or emerging from directions that should have been impossible for unmanned tires to navigate. Even when I was parked for my mandatory rest periods, I would lie in my sleeper berth, listening for the subtle sound of rubber on pavement that announced their presence. The knowledge that they were out there, arranged in their perfect formation and waiting for me to resume my journey, filled my nights with restless anxiety. I started parking in the most well-lit areas I could find, seeking comfort in the presence of other drivers and the steady hum of activity that marked busy truck stops. I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, scanning the roadside for signs of their approach. My driving suffered as my attention became divided between the road ahead and the persistent watchers behind. Other drivers began giving me strange looks when I asked if they'd seen anything unusual on the highways. My dispatcher started questioning my increasingly erratic schedule and route choices. It was during a particularly dark night in eastern Colorado that things escalated beyond mere observation. I was running through a stretch of highway construction where orange barrels and concrete barriers narrowed the lanes and reduced visibility. My speed had dropped to a crawl as I navigated the maze of detours and lane shifts. The construction zone stretched for miles, with only scattered work lights providing illumination. Instead of maintaining their usual following distance, they had moved closer, appearing just behind my trailer, in perfect alignment with my rear wheels. The sight in my mirror sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through my window. They were no longer content to merely follow. They were positioning themselves for something. As I rounded a curve marked by blinking warning lights, the tires suddenly accelerated. I watched in horror as they closed the distance with impossible speed, their silent rolling motion becoming aggressive and predatory. They spread out, flanking my trailer as if preparing to overtake me. The rational part of my mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, that tires don't hunt trucks like pack animals, but the evidence was right there in my mirror. The Kenworth's engine roared in protest, but I couldn't shake the pursuing tires. They matched my acceleration effortlessly, maintaining their formation despite the increased pace. As we approached a series of sharp curves, I realized with growing terror that they weren't just chasing me anymore. They were herding me towards something. The construction zone ended abruptly at the crest of a hill, opening onto a straight stretch of highway that dropped down into a valley. As I crested the rise, I saw what the tires had been driving me toward. The road ahead was completely blocked by dozens more tires, arranged in precise rows across both lanes, like some kind of rubber roadblock. They sat motionless in the darkness, their treads gleaming dully in my headlights. Panic surged through me as I realized I had only seconds to react. Slamming on the brakes would jackknife my trailer and likely send me rolling down the embankment. The shoulder was too narrow for 18 wheels, and the steep drop-off on both sides left no room for evasive maneuver. The pursuing tires had closed to within feet of my rear bumper, and ahead the motionless wall of rubber waited with patient malevolence. Static answered me initially, then a voice crackled through the speaker. It was distorted and strange, like air slowly leaking from a tire, but the words were clear enough. "Welcome to the family, driver. Time to rest those weary wheels." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The speedometer on my dashboard was showing 0, despite the feeling of movement and the sound of my engine. The scenery outside my windows had become a blur of repeating images, the same stretch of construction zone, playing over and over like a loop. The pursuing tires were no longer behind me, but somehow inside my mirrors, their dark profiles reflected in impossible positions. The Crimson Frequencies. From Marcus Delacroix. The dashboard of my Kenworth T680 had been bleeding light for 3 nights running, and I was beginning to think the electrical system had developed its own peculiar sense of humor. Not the usual amber glow of warning lights, or the sterile blue of the digital displays, but something altogether different, a slow, pulsing crimson that seemed to seep through the plastic like spilled wine through fabric. The mechanic in Bakersfield had scratched his head and run every diagnostic he could think of, but the truck's computer insisted everything was functioning perfectly. "All systems green," he'd said with a shrug, handing me back the keys. "Maybe it's just the desert playing tricks on your eyes." But I knew what I was seeing as I guided my rig through the Nevada wasteland at 3 in the morning, the endless ribbon of Interstate 80 stretching toward Reno like a prayer whispered into the darkness. The red light was there, undeniable, casting everything in my cab in shades of rust and shadow. It painted my hands on the steering wheel the color of dried blood, turned my logbook pages the hue of autumn leaves, and made my coffee in its thermos look like something I'd rather not contemplate. The strangest part was how it seemed to pulse in rhythm with something I couldn't quite identify. Not my heartbeat, not the engine's steady rumble, but something else entirely, something that made the fine hairs on my forearms stand at attention. I'd been running freight across the western states for nearly 2 decades, long enough to know that the night desert has its own personality, its own way of making even the most rational man question what his senses are telling him. The vast emptiness out here seems to concentrate every strange thing in the world and serve it up to lonely truckers like me, wrapped in mirages and acoustic tricks and the kind of silence that makes you hear things that might not actually be there. But this was different. This crimson bleeding from my dashboard felt personal, as if the truck itself was trying to tell me something in a language I'd never learned to speak. The radio had been acting strangely too, cycling through frequencies on its own, catching fragments of conversations and music from stations that shouldn't have been able to reach this far into the desert. Earlier that evening, I'd heard what sounded like a 1940s big band arrangement bleeding through the static, complete with crooning vocals and the scrape of dancing shoes on the distant ballroom floor. Then it had switched to what might have been an emergency broadcast in Spanish, a woman's voice urgent and frightened, before dissolving into the kind of white noise that makes you think of television screens in empty hotel rooms. As I crested a low hill and saw the scattered lights of a truck stop glowing in the distance like a small constellation fallen to earth, the bleeding light in my dashboard suddenly intensified, pulsing faster now, almost strobic. The radio crackled to life without my touching any controls, and a voice emerged from the speakers, clear as mountain water and twice as cold. "Marcus," it said, pronouncing my name with careful precision as if testing the weight of each syllable. "Marcus Delacroix." westbound, in the red Kenworth. You're going to want pull over at the next opportunity. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white in the crimson wash of light from the dashboard. Nobody had my CB channel. Nobody knew my name or the color of my truck, unless they could see me. And the highway stretched empty in both directions, as far as my headlights could penetrate. I'd been alone out here for the better part of 50 miles, with nothing but sagebrush and jackrabbits for company. The voice on the radio continued, patient and somehow familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. There's something you need to understand about that light, Marcus. It's not a malfunction. It's not your electrical system playing game. It's a frequency, a wavelength that most people can't perceive, but your truck has been modified to receive it. The previous owner made certain adjustments before he passed on. You might remember him, tall fellow, always wore a black baseball cap, had that nervous laugh that sounded like breaking glass. I did remember him, Eddie Kowalski, the trucker I'd bought the Kenworth from 6 months ago at an auction in Phoenix. He'd seemed eager to sell, kept mentioning that he needed to get out of the business for health reasons, though he'd looked healthy enough to me, just nervous, maybe. Kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to interrupt our transaction. I'd gotten the truck for a fraction of what it should have cost, and I'd assumed I was simply lucky. Eddie had died 3 weeks later. Heart attack according to the obituary I'd found online. 47 years old. No history of cardiac problem. The voice on the radio laughed, and it was exactly the sound I remembered from Eddie, like breaking glass, sharp and jagged and wrong. He tried to have the modifications removed. Did you know that? Spent his last month visiting every truck mechanic between Phoenix and Portland, trying to find someone who could undo what he'd had done. But you can't uninvent a color, Marcus. You can't unsee a frequency once your eyes have been opened to it. I was approaching the truck stop now, and I could see that it was busy. Despite the late hour, maybe a dozen rigs lined up in the parking area, their running lights creating a Christmas display against the desert night. But as I watched, still 2 miles out, the crimson bleeding from my dashboard began to reveal something else entirely. In that red light, the truck stop looked different, older somehow, as if I was seeing it through a filter that showed not what was, but what had been, or perhaps what would be. The building appeared weathered and run down, its windows cracked and dark. The other trucks in the parking lot looked like antiques, their designs dating back decades, their chrome dulled with rust and age, and moving between them, barely visible in the pulsing red glow, were figures that didn't quite move like living people, too fluid in some ways, too rigid in others, as if they were following a script written for a play that had closed long ago but continued to run for an audience of one. "Pull over, Marcus," the voice on the radio insisted, though it was beginning to break up now, dissolving into static punctuated by what sounded like Morse code. "You need to understand what you're carrying. Every load you've hauled in the past 6 months, every delivery you've made, you haven't been transporting freight. You've been broadcasting. That light bleeding from your dashboard, it's encoding your location, your route, your schedule. It's painting you red so others can find you." I considered driving past the truck stop, continuing on toward Reno without stopping, but my fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and the next services weren't for another 80 miles. Besides, I needed to understand what was happening to me, what Eddie Kowalski had passed along with the truck's title and registration. The bleeding light pulsed faster as I took the off-ramp, and now I could see both versions of the truck stop simultaneously. The modern facility with its bright fluorescent lights and clean restrooms, overlaid with the ghostly image of something much older and more worn, a place that existed in the frequency of crimson light. As I pulled into a parking space between two other semis, I noticed that their drivers were nowhere to be seen, though their running lights were on and their engines were still warm. The building ahead of me flickered between its two states, new and old, real and remembered, present and something else entirely. Through the windows I could see figures moving around inside, but they left no shadows on the walls, cast no reflections in the glass surfaces. The radio crackled once more, Eddie's laughing, breaking glass voice, emerging from layers of static. "Welcome to the frequency, Marcus. Population, well, that depends on how you count. The living and the broadcast, the red and the scene, the freight and the freighted. You'll find everyone here very accommodating, very understanding. After all, we've all been where you are now." That whoa. I turned off the NE but left the key in the ignition, ready to flee if necessary. The dashboard continued to bleed its crimson light, even with the truck powered down, painting everything in my cab the color of warning, the color of danger, the color of something that should have stayed buried with Eddie Kowalski in his Phoenix cemetery. Outside, the truck stop waited in its dual existence, both invitation and trap, both sanctuary and snare. Taking a deep breath that tasted of desert dust and electrical fire, I opened the cab door and stepped down into the Nevada night, where the air hummed with frequencies I was only beginning to understand, and the ground beneath my feet felt less solid than it should have, as if reality itself was bleeding light around the edges, showing me glimpses of worlds that existed in wavelength human eyes were never meant to perceive. Behind me, my truck's dashboard continued its crimson pulse, broadcasting my arrival to an audience I couldn't see but could increasingly. The hauler's silent prayer, from Marcus Wheeler. The thing about driving 18-wheelers for 37 years is that you develop rituals, little ceremonies that keep you sane during those endless miles between here and somewhere else. Mine was always the same prayer I'd whisper into the darkness of my cab before firing up Big Martha, my 2018 Peterbilt FF9. Nothing fancy, just a simple request to whatever forces governed the highways to keep my wheels turning true and my cargo safe. I never expected anyone to answer back. It started on a Tuesday night in late October, somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow on the 58, when the desert air carried that peculiar chill that makes even seasoned drivers reach for an extra cup of coffee. I'd been hauling electronics westbound, nothing special, just another load in a career filled with countless others. The radio had been playing that soft country music I preferred for night driving, the kind that doesn't jar you awake but keeps you company in the gentle way an old friend might. The windshield wipers moved in their steady rhythm against a light drizzle that had followed me out of the Central Valley, creating that hypnotic percussion that can either lull you into dangerous drowsiness or settle you into that perfect driving trance where miles disappear beneath your wheels like pages turning in a well-worn book. That's when I first heard it, so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the engine harmonizing with the rain. A voice, soft as whispered silk, seemed to rise from somewhere deep within Big Martha's dashboard. At first I thought maybe the CB radio had caught some distant transmission, but the voice wasn't speaking in the rough vernacular of truckers or the clinical precision of dispatchers. Instead, it carried the cadence of prayer, words I couldn't quite make out but that felt familiar in the way childhood memories feel familiar, warm and distant, and tinged with something you can't quite name. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights marking some small town, whose name I'd forgotten as soon as I'd passed its city limits sign. The mountains rose like sleeping giants against the star-scattered sky, and my headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness that seemed to close behind me as if I were swimming through liquid night. The voice continued, rising and falling with the rhythm of my engine, and I found myself leaning forward, straining to catch the words that danced just beyond comprehension. It spoke of protection for travelers, of safe passage through the dark hours when the world belongs to different rules than those that govern daylight. The words were old-fashioned, formal in the way my grandmother's prayers had been when she'd tuck me in during those long summers I'd spent at her farm in Missouri. There was comfort in that voice, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very bones of my truck, and I felt my shoulders relax as the tension of the long haul began to ease. But as the nights passed and the voice became a regular companion on my runs, I began to notice other changes. Other drivers on the CB started mentioning me in ways that made little sense. That Wheeler fellow once said during a conversation I was monitoring, "Drives like he's got guardian angels riding shotgun." Another mentioned seeing my truck take curves that should have been impossible at the speeds I was traveling, and a third swore he'd watched me navigate through a pile-up on I-40 by threading between vehicles and spaces that couldn't have existed. The thing was, I didn't remember any of these incidents. My driving felt normal to me, smooth and careful as it had always been, but the fuel receipts told a different story. I was covering distances that should have taken longer, arriving at destinations ahead of schedule, in ways that defied the speed limits I knew I was observing. My logbook showed rest stops I couldn't recall taking, and routes I was certain I hadn't traveled. The voice began speaking more frequently, not just during my evening prayer but throughout the long nocturnal hours. Sometimes it would warn me of hazards ahead, speaking of black ice on bridges I couldn't yet see or debris in lanes that appeared clear in my headlight. Each time, within minutes, the predicted danger would materialize exactly as described, and I'd find myself navigating obstacles with a precision that felt like muscle memory from someone else's body. One morning, while refueling at a truck stop outside Flagstaff, I struck up a conversation with an old-timer named Earl, who'd been hauling freight since before I was born. His weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup like they were trying to gather its warmth into his very bones, and his eyes held that 1,000-mile stare that comes from seeing too many sunrises through a windshield. "Heard about you on the radio. Drivers are saying you've been touched by something." He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone reading a map. "Used to know another driver like you, maybe 15 years back. Name was Rodriguez. Hauled produce up and down the coast. Started hearing voices in his cab. Began making runs that defied physics. Cargo always arrived perfect, never a scratch or a delay. I felt something cold settle in my stomach despite the warm coffee. What happened to him?" Earl's expression grew distant, and he stared out the window at the endless parade of 18-wheelers moving through the lot like mechanical cattle. One day his truck was found on a mountain road in Colorado, engine still running, logbook filled out neat as you please. But Rodriguez was gone, never found so much as a hair from his head. The strange thing was, his truck was sitting right in the middle of a road that had been closed for construction for 3 months. No way in, no way out, but there she sat, purring like a contented cat. That evening, as I prepared to pull out of the truck stop, I hesitated before beginning my usual prayer. The voice had become such a constant companion that I'd stopped questioning its origin, but Earl's story had planted seeds of doubt that grew like weeds in the fertile soil of my unease. Still, the ritual was too deeply ingrained to abandon, and I found myself whispering the familiar words into the darkness of my cab as Big Martha's engine settled into its comfortable rumble. The voice responded immediately, warmer and more intimate than ever before. This time, the words were crystal clear, spoken in a tone that carried infinite patience and what might have been affection. "Your faith has been noted, Marcus Wheeler. Your devotion to safe passage and careful stewardship has earned you protection beyond the ordinary boundaries of mortal concern. But all gifts carry obligations, and all protections require payment." The highway unrolled before me like a ribbon of destiny, and I realized that the other vehicles on the road seemed to be moving in slow motion, their taillights stretching into red streamers in my peripheral vision. My speedometer showed a steady 65, but the mile markers were flashing past at impossible intervals. The rain had returned, but instead of drumming against my windshield, each drop seemed to hang suspended in the air like tiny crystal ornaments before sliding away without sound. "What kind of payment?" I asked aloud, surprised by how natural it felt to engage in conversation with a voice that might not exist outside my own mind. "You have been faithful in your devotions, and now you are becoming something more than an ordinary hauler of freight. You are becoming a guardian of the roads, a shepherd of safe passage. But shepherds must sometimes leave their familiar pastures to tend flocks in stranger land." The landscape outside my windows began to change in ways that made no sense. The familiar desert was still there, but it seemed to exist in multiple layers, with other roads visible beneath and above my own, ghostly highways populated by the shadows of vehicles from different eras. I saw the phantom outlines of horse-drawn wagons and early automobiles sharing space with trucks that looked like they belonged in some chrome-plated future I couldn't imagine. They were the prayers of travelers from different times and places, all seeking the same thing I had requested night after night: safe passage through the darkness, protection from the hazards that lurked beyond the reach of headlights and human comprehension. "This is your calling now," the voice continued, and I realized it was no longer coming from my dashboard but seemed to emanate from the very air around me. "To answer the prayers of those who travel the roads between worlds, to guide cargo that must reach destinations that exist only for those who know how to find them. Your truck has become a vessel for something larger than commerce or convenience." I wanted to protest, to demand a return to the simple certainty of pickup and delivery schedules, but I found that the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a profound sense of rightness, as if I'd been preparing for this moment throughout my entire career without knowing. The frequency of fear. From Jake Sullivan. The static crackle of my CB radio has been my companion for 15 years of long-haul trucking, carrying conversations across the lonely highways of America like whispers in the dark. Most nights the chatter is routine: traffic reports, weather warnings, the occasional joke shared between drivers who've never met but know each other's voices better than their own neighbors. But there was something different about the transmission I picked up on Interstate 40, somewhere between Amarillo and Albuquerque, during those dead hours when the world feels thin and strange. I was piloting my '98 Peterbilt through the New Mexico desert, the engine's steady rumble mixing with the gentle hiss of wind across sagebrush. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m., and the highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon under a canopy of stars. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the caffeine still buzzed through my veins, keeping me alert as I navigated the gentle curves and endless straightaways of this desolate stretch. The CB had been quiet for the last hour, just the occasional burst of static or distant voices too faint to understand. I was considering switching it off when a clear voice cut through the white noise, speaking with the measured cadence of someone reading from a script. "Good evening, night riders. This is Desert Oracle with your midnight fortune cast. The winds are whispering secrets tonight, and the road has stories to tell." The voice belonged to a woman, smooth and hypnotic, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. For the driver in the white Peterbilt, eastbound on the 40, mile marker 213, the cards show a choice approaching, 3 exits ahead. You'll see a rest stop with a broken neon sign. The wise traveler continues straight, for some rest stops offer no rest at all. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. A white Peterbilt eastbound, That was me. Mile marker 213 had passed just minutes ago. The specificity of the message sent a chill down my spine. Despite the warm air flowing from my vent, I grabbed the CB handset, my thumb hovering over the talk button. Desert Oracle, this is Highway Jake. How do you know what I'm driving? My voice crackled through the speaker, but no response came, just static, as if the transmission had never happened at all. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but the mysterious fortune teller had vanished into the electromagnetic void. 3 exits ahead, I told myself, watching for the rest stop she'd mentioned. The desert landscape rolled past my windows, bathed in silver moonlight and punctuated by the occasional ranch house glowing like a lonely beacon. My rational mind tried to dismiss the whole thing. Probably just a coincidence. Maybe someone who'd spotted my truck at an earlier stop. But the way she'd spoken, with such certainty about the mile marker and the choice approaching, made my skin crawl with unease. 20 minutes later, I saw it. A faded blue sign announced Desert Dreams Rest Area, 1 mile. And as I took the off-ramp, my headlights swept across exactly what the Desert Oracle had described. The rest stop's neon sign flickered erratically, half the letters dark and dead, casting an uneven pink glow across a mostly empty parking lot. Only 2 other vehicles occupied the space, a rusted sedan and an RV that had seen better decades. I should have listened. I should have continued straight as the voice had warned. But curiosity and a stubborn streak that had gotten me in trouble before compelled me to park near the building. The diesel engine settled into silence, and suddenly the desert quiet felt oppressive, broken only by the buzz of struggling fluorescent lights and the distant howl of coyotes. The building itself was a relic from the 60s, all atomic age angles and faded turquoise paint that had been scoured by decades of sandstorms. Through the grimy windows, I could see the glow of vending machines and the pale illumination of restroom signs. Nothing overtly threatening, yet something about the place felt wrong, like a photograph slightly out of focus. As I walked toward the entrance, gravel crunching under my boots, the CB in my truck crackled to life again. Even at this distance, I could hear the Desert Oracle's voice drifting through the open windows. The choice has been made, White Peterbilt. The rest stop remembers everyone who enters. Some check out, but some, well, the desert keeps its secret. I turned back toward my truck, but the voice continued, growing clearer despite the distance I was putting between myself and the radio. Look for the guest book inside, Jake Sullivan. Look for the guest book and see how many travelers have signed in, but never signed out. She knew my name, my full name. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I broke into a cold sweat despite the warm desert air. I hadn't told anyone my name over the radio, hadn't used it on any of my paperwork since leaving the truck stop in Amarillo. Yet this mysterious broadcaster knew exactly who I was, what I was driving, and where I was headed. Against every instinct, screaming at me to get back in my truck and leave, I pushed through the rest stop's glass door. The interior smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else. Something stale and organic, like old flowers left too long in stagnant water. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed and flickered, casting the space in an uncomfortable strobing that made shadows dance in my peripheral vision. The kind you might find at a funeral home or a quaint bed and breakfast, completely out of place in a highway rest stop. My hands trembled as I opened the cover, revealing page after page of signatures, dates, and brief messages from travelers. The entries were normal at first. Great facilities. The Johnson family, 6/15/2019. Clean restrooms. Thank you, Maria V. But as I flipped through the pages, A pattern began to emerge. The same names appeared over and over again, but the dates were wrong. Impossible. Robert Chen. 3 of 22 2020 appeared on one page, then again on another dated 3 of 22 2022. Same handwriting, same blue ink, same brief message. Stopped here last year. Feels familiar. Margaret Torres had apparently signed the book every October 8th for the past 7 years. Each time writing, first visit. Strange dreams last night. Best night. Bessening. Churned as I realized what I was seeing. These people weren't returning to the rest stop annually on the same date. They were trapped, reliving the same moment over and over, each time believing it was their first visit. The rest stop was collecting travelers, holding them in some kind of temporal loop, while they remained blissfully unaware of their situation. The CB static grew louder even inside the building, and the Desert Oracle's voice emerged from the white noise like a ship appearing through fog. The guest book tells stories, doesn't it, Jake? Every signature is a soul, the desert claimed. But you still have a choice. Sign the book and join the eternal rest. Resist and face the hunger of the hungry desert. I slammed the guest book shut and backed toward the door, but the glass wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed as if welded in place. Through the windows I could see my truck sitting in the parking lot, its chrome gleaming under the broken neon, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me. The fluorescent lights began cycling faster, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made it difficult to focus. In the flickering illumination, I caught glimpses of other people in the rest stop, translucent figures moving through their routines, checking their phones, buying sodas from the vending machines, completely unaware of their ghostly state. They were the trapped travelers, endlessly repeating their brief stops at Desert Dreams. The signature completes the binding. The Desert Oracle's voice whispered from speakers I couldn't see. One name in the book, and the loop closes. Refuse, and become something else entirely. The desert has many hungers, Jake Sullivan. The rest stop is just the gentlest of them. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal, just a message I'd never seen before. Network unavailable. Temporal interference detected. Even the emergency services were beyond my reach in this place that existed outside normal time and space. The vending machines began to hum louder, their displays flickering through beverage options that hadn't existed for decades. Brands I remembered from childhood, mixed with products that looked futuristic, as if the machines were cycling through past and future simultaneously. The trapped spirits continued their routines, occasionally walking directly through me with a sensation like ice water flowing through my bones. The horn that answered back, from Miguel Santos.
The end.
The first time I heard that horn growl back at me, I thought maybe the diesel fumes were getting to my head after 18 straight hours on Interstate 8. You know how it is out here in the long stretches between Reno and Salt Lake City, where the desert spreads out like a black ocean under the stars, and the only company you have is the steady rumble of your engine and whatever late-night radio station hasn't faded to static yet. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 37-9 for the better part of 15 years, and she'd never made a sound I couldn't explain, never given me a moment's doubt about what was machine and what was something else entirely. The night it started, I was hauling a load of furniture from a warehouse in Sacramento to a distribution center in Denver. Nothing unusual about the cargo, nothing that should have made the trailer feel heavier than it was, or caused the subtle shift in my truck's behavior that I noticed around midnight. The desert air was cool for September, and I had the windows cracked just enough to let in the sage-scented breeze that always reminded me of my grandmother's ranch in New Mexico. The CB radio had been quiet for miles, just the occasional trucker checking in with his location or warning about a speed trap ahead. and I was settling into that meditative rhythm that long-haul drivers know well, where the road becomes a ribbon of light stretching endlessly forward and time seems to slow to match the steady pulse of the diesel engine. Nothing unusual about that either, except for the way they seem to flicker occasionally, as if the driver was having electrical problems, or maybe signaling something I couldn't understand. I kept my speed steady at the legal limit, expecting the other truck to pass when it was ready, but instead those lights settled in behind me and stayed there, maintaining the same distance no matter how the road curved or climbed through the low hills that rose from the desert floor like sleeping giants. After 20 minutes of this strange dance, I reached for my air horn and gave it a friendly double blast, the universal trucker greeting that says hello and asks if everything's all right. The sound echoed across the empty landscape, bouncing off distant mesas and fading into the vast silence that surrounds you out here, where civilization feels like a memory and the stars press down so close, you feel like you could reach up and pluck them from the sky. I expected either no response or maybe a return blast from the truck behind me, but what I heard instead made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert air flowing through my cabin. The sound that came back wasn't the sharp mechanical blast of an air horn, or even the deeper note of a diesel engine backfiring. It was something organic and primal, a low growling that seemed to roll across the asphalt like thunder, but thunder with intention, with intelligence behind it, as if some massive predator had awakened in the darkness and was responding to my call with a challenge of its own. The sound lasted longer than any horn blast should, rising and falling with an almost musical quality that made my skin crawl and set every instinct I had screaming that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I checked my mirrors again, but the headlights behind me looked normal now, just two steady beams cutting through the night like any other truck on the highway. My CB crackled with static, and I grabbed the microphone with a hand that was steadier than it should have been, considering what I'd just heard. I keyed the mic and called out to the driver behind me, asking for his handle and wondering if he'd heard anything unusual. But the only response was more static, and the distant sound of some other conversation fading in and out of range. Two drivers discussing weather conditions near the Colorado border, as if this was just another normal night on the interstate. The miles rolled by, and I began to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that fatigue and long hours had played a trick on my ears and turned a perfectly ordinary horn blast into something sinister and unnatural. But then I came to a long, straight stretch of road, where the highway cut through a valley between two ranges of hills, and the urge to test my theory became too strong to ignore. I reached for the air horn again, this time giving it 3 short blasts, and immediately regretted my curiosity when the answering sound came back even stronger than before. The growl that rolled across the desert was deep and resonant, with undertones that seemed to vibrate through the frame of my truck and into my bones. It was the sound a mountain might make if it could voice its displeasure, or the noise that darkness itself would create if it had a throat and lungs, and the desire to communicate with the small, fragile creatures that dared to challenge its domain with their headlights and engines and foolish bravery. I glanced in my mirrors again, expecting to see something different, something that would explain what was happening, but the truck behind me looked perfectly normal. Chrome bumper gleaming in my taillights. A conventional cab that could have belonged to any of 1,000 drivers working these routes. Headlights that betrayed nothing unusual about the vehicle or its operator. But as I watched, something about those lights began to bother me in a way I couldn't quite define, and it took several minutes of careful observation before I realized what was wrong. The headlights never wavered, never shifted position even slightly as the road curved and climbed, never showed the natural movement you'd expect from a driver making tiny steering corrections, or adjusting his position in his seat. They stayed perfectly centered and perfectly steady, as if they were fixed in position by something more rigid than human hands on a steering wheel. And the longer I watched them, the more convinced I became that whatever was following me wasn't entirely subject to the same physical laws that governed normal vehicles on normal roads. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, more than enough to reach the next truck stop. But suddenly the idea of continuing down this empty highway with my strange companion seemed less appealing than finding civilization and other people, even if it meant breaking up my driving time and potentially falling behind schedule. I started watching for exit signs, hoping to find a town large enough to have an all-night diner, or at least a well-lit gas station where I could park my rig and figure out what was happening. But the signs that appeared in my headlights offered nothing but small communities with names I didn't recognize, and no indication of services available for travelers. The radio had fallen completely silent now, not even the distant chatter of other drivers to remind me that I wasn't the only person moving through the darkness on business and dreams and the simple human need to keep moving forward. I tried switching channels, looking for anything that would connect me to the normal world of commerce and conversation, but found only static on every frequency, as if some invisible barrier had fallen between my truck and the rest of human civilization. That's when I made the mistake of testing my horn one more time, driven by a combination of curiosity and growing fear that demanded I understand what was happening, even if the knowledge came with a price I wasn't prepared to pay. This time I held the button down for a full 10 seconds. Sending a long, sustained blast across the desert that echoed off canyon walls and disturbed whatever creatures lived in the darkness beyond the reach of my headlight. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a roar that seemed to come not just from the truck behind me, but from the desert itself, from the hills and valleys and empty spaces where nothing should exist except wind and stone, and the patient silence of geological time. The sound filled my cab despite the closed windows, vibrating through my chest and making my teeth ache, and for a moment the very air seemed to thicken around me, as if the night had become something solid and pressed. Not the warm yellow of halogen bulbs or even the harsh white of modern LED arrays, but a cold blue radiance that reminded me of pictures I'd seen of deep ocean creatures, the kind that live in trenches so deep that sunlight has never touched them, and evolution has taken strange turns in the darkness. The light was wrong in every way that mattered, wrong in its color and intensity and in the way it seemed to pierce through my truck's solid metal and glass as if they were no more substantial than fog. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my truck beyond the speed limit for the first time in years, watching my speedometer climb past 70, and then 75 as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. But those lights stayed exactly the same distance behind me, neither falling back nor closing the gap, maintaining their unnatural steadiness, no matter how fast I drove, or how sharply the road curved through the increasingly rugged terrain. I finally saw what I'd been praying for, the green glow of an exit sign advertising food and fuel, and below it the warm yellow lights of what looked like a truck stop, with the familiar shapes of big rigs parked in neat rows, and the comforting geometry of a building designed for people like me, people who lived on the highway. The Kenworth's Vendetta. For Marcus, I have been driving long haul for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the highway could throw at me. Blown tires and thunderstorms, black ice that sends your trailer sliding sideways, even the occasional drunk who thinks they can race an 18-wheeler. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Interstate 80 last October, when I met a truck that seemed to have developed a personal grudge against me. Dia. It started innocuously enough, the way these things always do. I was hauling electronics from Sacramento to Chicago, running 3 days behind schedule because of a breakdown in Reno. The replacement part for my refrigeration unit had taken longer to arrive than expected, and my dispatcher was breathing down my neck about delivery time. So there I was, pushing hard through Nevada in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, my headlights cutting through the desert darkness, while the radio played soft country ballads that barely masked the steady drone of my diesel engine. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, that hypnotic ribbon of asphalt that every trucker knows intimately. Mile markers ticked by in regular intervals, their reflective surfaces catching my headlights for brief moments before disappearing into the rearview mirror. The air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain through my partially open window. Everything felt normal, routine even, until I noticed the headlights in my mirror. They appeared suddenly, twin orbs of brilliant white light that seemed too bright, too focused. At first I assumed it was another trucker running late like myself, maybe someone else trying to make up time on the empty desert highway. The lights maintained a steady distance behind me, perhaps a quarter-mile back, matching my speed with mechanical precision. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, I began to feel an uncomfortable prickle of awareness creeping up my spine. The truck never varied its distance. When I slowed down for a construction zone, it slowed. When I sped up on a long downhill grade, it kept perfect pace. Most drivers would pass eventually, especially on these long straight stretches where visibility extends for miles. But this one seemed content to follow, maintaining that exact spacing, like it was tethered to my trailer by an invisible chain. I tried raising the mystery driver on the CB radio, cycling through channels and calling out my position. Northbound big truck on I-80, mile marker 24/7. You've got a buddy behind you looking to make conversation. Nothing. Just the usual static and occasional chatter from drivers, hundreds of miles away. The silence from my follower felt deliberate, almost pointed, as if whoever was back there had no interest in the informal fellowship that usually exists between long-haul drives. As dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, painting the desert floor in soft shades of pink and gold, I caught my first clear glimpse of the pursuing truck. It was a Kenworth W900, midnight blue, with chrome stacks that gleamed in the early morning light. A beautiful rig, the kind that speaks to serious money and meticulous maintenance. But something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately articulate what bothered me. The truck appeared pristine, almost showroom perfect, yet it moved with a predatory grace that seemed at odds with the usual lumbering presence of heavy freight vehicles. I decided to test my growing suspicions at the next truck stop, a sprawling complex of fuel islands and parking spaces that materialized from the desert like an oasis. I signaled early and pulled in slowly, watching my mirrors as the Kenworth continued past without even slowing down. Relief washed over me as those distinctive headlights disappeared around a distant curve, and I told myself I'd been imagining things. Too many hours on the road, and too much caffeine can play tricks on a driver's mind. I took my time at the truck top, topping off my tanks, grabbing a shower, and forcing myself to eat a proper breakfast instead of just downing another energy drink. The parking lot buzzed with the usual morning activity of drivers beginning their day, checking their equipment, and planning their routes. Everything felt normal and reassuring, grounding me back in the familiar rhythms of professional trucking. But when I pulled back onto the interstate 2 hours later, the Kenworth was waiting. As I approached, I could see the driver's silhouette through the windshield, motionless and somehow expectant. The truck pulled in behind me as I passed, assuming that same precise following distance as if no time had elapsed at all. The realization that this was deliberate sent ice water through my veins. Someone was actively stalking me across hundreds of miles of highway, and I had no idea why. I ran through possibilities in my mind. Road rage from some forgotten slight, a case of mistaken identity, competition between trucking companies that had somehow turned personal. None of it made sense, but the evidence was undeniable as those familiar headlights settled into my mirrors once again. It began varying its distance, sometimes dropping back until it was barely visible, other times surging forward until I could see its massive chrome grille filling my mirrors. The driver started flashing his high beams in irregular patterns that felt like some kind of sinister Morse code. When other traffic appeared, the Kenworth would fall back and behave normally, but the moment we were alone on the highway, the harassment resumed. I tried everything I could think of to lose my pursuer. I took random exits and sat in gas station parking lots, hoping the other driver would give up and move on. The Kenworth would park across the street and wait, engine idling patiently. I attempted sudden lane changes and speed variations, but my follower anticipated every move with supernatural precision. Most unsettling of all, I began to notice that the truck seemed to know my route better than I did, sometimes positioning itself at on-ramps ahead of me, as if it had taken shortcuts that shouldn't have been possible. By the time I reached Wyoming, exhaustion was setting in, despite my efforts to stay alert. The stress of constant surveillance was wearing me down, making my hands shake slightly on the steering wheel and causing my eyes to dart compulsively to the mirrors every few seconds. The Kenworth had become a malevolent presence in my peripheral vision, a blue and chrome shadow that radiated hostility across the gap between our vehicles. As evening approached, and traffic thinned out on a particularly desolate stretch of highway, the other truck made its move. It began accelerating, pulling into the left lane alongside my trailer. I expected it to pass, finally ending this bizarre cat and mouse game. But instead it matched my speed and held position. Through my side window, I could see the massive truck keeping perfect pace, close enough that I could make out details of its pristine paint job and gleaming chrome accessory. The cab appeared empty, its windows dark and reflecting only the last traces of daylight. But that was impossible. The truck was moving with too much precision and purpose to be operating without human control. I leaned forward, trying to get a better angle, and that's when the Kenworth suddenly swerved toward me. I yanked my steering wheel to the right, feeling my trailer sway dangerously as the other truck's front bumper missed my fuel tank by inches. The Kenworth corrected its course immediately, pulling back into the left lane as if nothing had happened. But the message was clear. This wasn't just psychological harassment anymore. Someone was actively trying to force me off the road. The attacks continued for the next 50 miles, always when no other traffic was visible. The Kenworth would pull alongside me and drift gradually closer until I was forced to edge toward the shoulder, then retreat at the last possible moment. Sometimes it would fall back and surge forward again, its chrome grille looming in my mirrors like the jaws of some mechanical predator. The driver's timing was perfect, always managing to look innocent whenever another vehicle appeared on the horizon. I was approaching my physical and mental limits when I spotted the lights of a way station ahead. These facilities are staffed by Department of Transportation officers who have the authority to inspect commercial vehicles and cite drivers for violations. If I could make it there, I'd have witnesses and hopefully some protection from whatever madness was pursuing me. I signaled and began slowing down for the way station entrance, watching as the Kenworth continued past at highway speed. But instead of relief, I felt a chill of premonition. The other truck was accelerating, moving faster than any loaded commercial vehicle should travel on this stretch of road. It crested a hill ahead of the way station and disappeared from view, but something told me this wasn't over. The DOT officer on duty listened politely to my story, but clearly thought I was suffering from road fatigue and an overactive imagination. He suggested I get some rest and maybe consider talking to a counselor about stress management. I couldn't blame him for his skepticism. The cargo that whispered, from Marcus Chen. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my CB radio at 3:17 in the morning, pulling me from the hypnotic rhythm of rain against my windshield. I'd been hauling freight for Meridian Transport for 12 years, and in all that time, I'd never received a pickup order quite like this one. The coordinates led to a facility I'd never heard of, nestled deep in the Nevada desert, miles from any major highway or town that appeared on my Jeep. My 18-wheeler hummed steadily through the desert darkness, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the endless black. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the asphalt slick and gleaming under the occasional streetlight. I adjusted my rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of my own tired eyes, wondering why this particular run paid triple the usual rate for what the manifest described, simply as specialized scientific equipment, handled with extreme care. The facility materialized from the darkness, like something from another world. No corporate logos, no identifying signs, just a collection of pristine white buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing that seemed to stretch impossibly high into the night sky. Security lights bathed everything in harsh, clinical white, creating stark shadows that shifted and danced as I pulled up to the gate. A guard in an unmarked uniform approached my cab, his face pale and drawn, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in months. He checked my identification with unusual thoroughness, scanning some kind of device over my license, and making several phone calls in a language I couldn't identify. The whole process took nearly 20 minutes, during which I noticed something peculiar about the facility's lighting. Every few seconds, all the lights would dim simultaneously for just a moment, as if something massive was drawing power from their grid. The guard finally waved me through, directing me to a loading dock at the rear of the largest building. The loading dock was staffed by technicians wearing full hazmat suits, their faces obscured behind reflective visors. They moved with practiced efficiency, but I could sense an underlying tension in their movements, a carefulness that went beyond normal safety protocol. The cargo they loaded into my trailer consisted of 6 identical containers, each roughly the size of a refrigerator, constructed from some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols were etched into their surfaces, symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. His voice was muffled through the suit's communication system, giving it an otherworldly quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. He explained that the containers required specific environmental conditions during transport, maintaining a constant temperature of exactly 37 degrees Celsius and complete isolation from any electromagnetic interference. He handed me a modified CB radio, instructing me to use only this device for communication during the haul, as standard radio frequencies might damage the cargo. The destination coordinates took me north through California and into Oregon, to another unmarked facility hidden in the Cascade Mountains. The route avoided all major cities and population centers, winding through back roads and forgotten highways that barely appeared on most maps. As I pulled away from the loading dock, I noticed that my truck's engine sounded different, deeper somehow, as if the additional weight was far greater than what 6 containers should produce. But somewhere near the California border, I began to notice something unsettling. The modified CB radio they'd given me was picking up transmissions, fragments of conversations in languages that didn't sound quite human. The voices had an odd cadence, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost musical, yet deeply disturbing. I tried adjusting the frequency, but the transmissions followed me across every channel, growing clearer as the night progressed. By dawn, I was climbing through the Sierra Nevada mountains, my engine straining against the grade. That's when I first heard the sound from my trailer, a low humming that seemed to resonate through the entire trailer. It wasn't mechanical, nothing like the normal creaks and groans of cargo shifting during transport. This was something else entirely, organic and alive, like the sound of something breathing in harmonious rhythm. I pulled over at a rest stop to check the load, but the trailer's rear doors were sealed with locks I'd never seen before, complex mechanisms that required no key but seemed to respond to some other form of activation. As I stood beside my trailer in the early morning light, I noticed that the temperature gauge on my refrigeration unit was fluctuating wildly, despite the technician's emphasis on maintaining exact conditions. More disturbing still, I could feel a subtle vibration through the trailer's walls, as if the containers were somehow alive, pulsing with their own internal rhythm. The humming grew louder when I placed my hand against the metal surface, and for just a moment, I could swear I heard something that sounded like whispered words in an unknown language. The mountains grew steeper as I continued north, my truck laboring through narrow passes where cell phone coverage vanished entirely. The modified CB radio continued its stream of alien transmissions, and I began to realize that some of the voices were speaking about my cargo, referencing coordinates and timetables in that unsettling, musical language. Occasionally, I caught fragments that sounded almost like English, words like threshold, convergence, and awakening, spoken with an inflection that made my skin crawl. Afternoon brought heavy cloud cover that seemed to follow my truck specifically, creating a moving shadow across the landscape that extended for miles in every direction. Other vehicles on the highway appeared to unconsciously avoid my lanes, drifting away as if sensing something wrong with my rig. I noticed that birds refused to fly over my trailer, and the few animals I spotted along the roadside would freeze completely when I passed, as if paralyzed by some invisible force. My headlights seemed dimmer somehow, as if the darkness itself was actively consuming the light. The humming from my trailer had evolved into something more complex, a symphony of overlapping tones that created harmonies no earthly instrument could produce. The sound penetrated every surface of my cab, making my bones ache and my vision blur at the edges. They weren't quite solid, more like distortions in the air itself, rippling forms that kept pace with my truck regardless of my speed. Sometimes they appeared to be reaching toward my cargo, while other times they seemed to be fleeing from it. The temperature inside my cab began to drop despite the heater running full blast, and frost started forming on the inside of my windshield in patterns that resembled the symbols etched on the containers. The modified CB radio erupted with activity as full darkness fell, a cacophony of those inhuman voices growing more excited with each passing mile. I began to understand that my cargo wasn't just being transported, it was being tracked, monitored by entities whose interest felt decidedly hostile. The voices spoke of containment failure and premature activation, terms that filled me with a dread I couldn't fully comprehend, but felt in every fiber of my being. Dashboard lights flickered randomly. My GPS displayed locations that couldn't possibly exist, and my engine began making sounds that defied mechanical explanation. The humming from my trailer had become so intense that I could feel it in my chest cavity, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat and somehow beginning to influence it, forcing my pulse to synchronize with whatever was awakening behind me. The destination facility appeared through the trees like a fortress of light against the overwhelming darkness of the forest. But as I approached the gates, I realized something was terribly wrong. The buildings were intact, the security lights were functioning, but there were no people anywhere to be seen. My headlights swept across empty guardhouses and abandoned vehicles, as if everyone had simply vanished in the middle of their duty. I brought my truck to a stop at the main gate, the humming from my trailer now so loud it was drowning out my engine noise. The modified CB radio fell silent for the first time in hours, creating an absence of sound that was somehow more terrifying than the alien transmissions had been. In that silence I could hear new sounds emerging from my cargo, scratching and scraping noises that suggested the containers were being opened from the inside. My side mirror reflected something impossible. The distorted air shapes that had been following me were now climbing onto my trailer, pressing against its walls with what appeared to be desperate urgency. But they weren't trying to get in. I realized with growing horror, they were trying to prevent something from getting out. The scratching sounds intensified, joined by what could only be described as the sound of reality itself, beginning to I threw my truck into gear and crashed through the facility's gate, racing toward the loading dock as my trailer rocked violently behind me. Whatever was in those containers was no longer content to remain dormant, and the entities that had been following me seemed to be losing their battle to keep it contained.